Hello my dear viewers, in this video I want to touch upon another important figure in New York City's history, that of Alexander Hamilton. Most importantly, I want to show you his house in Upper Manhattan, the Hamilton Grange. So let's begin our journey by the house itself, which is located in St. Nicholas Park, what you are looking at right now. Alexander Hamilton was born in 1755 or 57, we're not sure, on the Caribbean island of Nevis, which is a small little island right here to the right of Puerto Rico. He came to the United States in 1772, so, well, technically I should say he came to the colony of New York, as this is right before the American Revolution, hence the United States didn't exist just yet. But Hamilton, being young and ambitious, enrolled in King's College, which after the American Revolution was renamed Columbia College, and today Columbia University here in New York City. However, he never really finished his college education as the American Revolution broke out about 2 years later, and Hamilton joined the cause, proving his loyalty and most importantly, bravery on the battlefield, all the way until the end of the war really, as he was involved in the Battle of Yorktown, which was the last major battle of the war. By then, he was already on the staff of George Washington himself, creating a close bond and mutual respect with one another. And we can see that because George Washington, when he became the first president of the United States in 1789, he put Hamilton into his cabinet as the Secretary of Treasury. In this position, he established the modern financial system and helped bring the 13 colonies together into one nation. A fascinating figure with an incredible resume, who now probably more people know about, as few years ago, a tremendously popular Broadway musical, Hamilton, put him in the spotlight with many people. In 1780, so during the American Revolution, he married Elizabeth Schuyler, who came from a wealthy New York family, and they had 8 children together, settling in this home here. Well, this was actually their country estate, as he had an apartment and worked in his law office in Lower Manhattan. It is hard to believe, but everything you are looking at in front of you right now, this location basically, about 200 years ago, would have been considered way outside of the real New York City limits. In the back of the house, what you are seeing is actually the City College of New York, which is part of 25 schools that make up the City University of New York, CUNY. Beautiful buildings and location. But right there in its shadow is the Hamilton Grange. The house itself has an amazing history. It was completed in 1802 and since was moved 2 times. Here are the locations where the building used to stand. In position number 1, it stood until 1889 when it was moved into the second spot, and finally in 2008 it was relocated here into the park. Here are some photos from the National Park Service documenting the latest relocation of the house in 2008. Therefore, even though the house was moved twice, it always stayed on the estate of Alexander Hamilton, as all of this land used to belong to him. It had to be moved as the city was expanding into these parts, and in order to create the grid, the streets, the house stood in the way and so needed to be relocated. Here is a rough location where the house stood originally, and today you have these gorgeous, beautiful townhouses which were built in like between 1880s and 1910s or so. Oh, and we even have some for sale. So if any of you would like to contribute like $2 million, send me an email. I need friends like that. Here is the second location, St. Luke's Episcopal Church, which looks like it's going through major renovations. The church actually used the house itself for services and mass. Here is a statue of Alexander Hamilton by the church and the location of where the house stood. Here we are on the other side of the church, and right there across the street is the current location of the home to where it was moved for the second time. The house was built in what is called the federal style, in which you can see a lot of symmetry, like the fact that it has a balcony on one side and the other, right? I mean, the opposite sides of the house are the same. On the roof, you have 4 chimneys, even though only 2 of them work, but the other 2 are there again for symmetry. Here you have shutters on windows. Those metal things sticking out from the house, painted yellow, would hold the shutters in place so that they would not close. Inside, you have some nice collections of books and different Hamilton items if you want to buy them, and lots of interesting things, like a small model of the house itself, where again you can see that symmetry all the way up to the 4 chimneys on top. And on certain days and hours, you can take a tour of the upstairs, so I highly recommend it. You know, this place is maintained by the National Park Service, and I'll be honest, I already did few locations which are run by the Park Service, and everywhere I went and every staff member I talked to was always unbelievably nice and friendly, eager to answer all questions. Therefore, I highly recommend taking this tour if you like things like this. I particularly loved this room. This was Hamilton's travel desk, as he wrote a lot. But I love the room because of the green paint on the walls. I think this color really fits like a study room. But this type of color back in the days was pretty rare and not really healthy for you, because to certain colors of paint, they would add different chemicals like arsenic, which is toxic. And I believe they used to add that to the green color paint, if I'm not mistaken. So I showed you the home of Alexander Hamilton, but now let me show you where he is buried and the story of how his life came to a tragic end. However, before we make our way to Lower Manhattan, I want to stop by Riverside Park and do a little bit of a walk into the past. As this part of the video I recorded earlier, I forget if it was the end of September or the beginning of October. As you see, the leaves are still green and it was pretty warm outside. So just a month makes a very big difference in the city sometimes. Now, if some of you are watching my channel for a while, you know that I already partially walked through this park. That was in a video where we began in the Marcus Garvey Park, walked across Harlem, looking at things like the Apollo Theater and the Cotton Club, and finishing our walk in this park by the Fireman Memorial. Well, now, let's continue that walk because there is one thing I want to show you. Throughout the city, there are many things named after Alexander Hamilton, like the Alexander Hamilton Bridge, a statue of him in Central Park, and there is also something called the Hamilton Fountain, located in this park on 76th Street and Riverside Drive. Well, this fountain is not named after Alexander Hamilton, but rather his great-grandson, Robert Ray Hamilton. It was designed by Warren and Wetmore, which was the same firm that designed the Grand Central in New York City. And if I'm not mistaken, this is one of the last surviving horse troughs in the city. After all, it was meant to provide drinking water for the horses, which still ruled the streets in the beginning of the 1900s. Really by like 1930s, I would say, horses began to disappear, being overtaken by automobiles, and hence many of these horse troughs no longer served a purpose. Therefore, I felt not only is this pretty interesting to mention, but also gives New Yorkers another connection with Alexander Hamilton himself. But if anyone has the time, this is a nice park to visit, and there is a lot more things to see here, like for instance the Soldiers and Sailors Monument on about 89th Street. The monument was unveiled to the public in 1902, and it commemorates the Union Army soldiers and sailors from New York who had fought during the American Civil War. You can see some cannonballs on the side of the monument and some cannons in front of the monument itself. As you see today, the monument is fenced off for the safety of the public, as the structure is in need of restoration. And I believe this year, 2024, I read an article that the city will finally dedicate a few $1 million to the restoration of this monument. So hopefully, next time we will see this on this channel in some form or another, it will be looking much better and refreshed. We also have things like Joan of Arc Monument at 93rd Street, who was a young teenage girl leading the French army to victory against the English in the 1400s, claiming to be guided by God through various saints which would appear to her. However, she was caught and at the age of 19 accused of heresy and burned at the stake. There's also the Mount Tom, where the famous American poet and writer Edgar Allan Poe would come and sit for his inspirations. And right behind it is the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial Plaza, dedicated to those who fought in the Warsaw Ghetto uprising against the Germans in 1943. So in April of 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising began after German troops and police entered the ghetto to deport its surviving inhabitants. Warsaw Ghetto was established in 1940, so a few years prior, where the Jewish people of the city of Warsaw had to relocate themselves to this rather small area, which was essentially sealed off by a great wall and barbed fence, really making it one great prison, in which conditions were just horrible. In 1943, the people were to be resettled further east, and deportations began. However, quickly news spread that the resettlement meant certain death, as they were being transported to extermination centers. And so the uprising began. And even though it lasted for almost a month, the Germans regained control and the people were deported to death camps like Treblinka, for example. On 79th Street, we have the Boat Basin Marina, from where there are great views of the city and the George Washington Bridge in the distance. And the 79th Street Rotunda, which as you see is going through renovations as well. It was completed in 1937, and it's kind of an interesting place because you have street traffic on top, and then in the middle there's a restaurant and a nice beautiful fountain. So hopefully once it's completed, I will be able to show it to you once again in the future. But really, making this YouTube channel, I really realized how many projects and renovations are continuously happening around the city. It's really a city that keeps building and rebuilding and changing. No wonder one of the nicknames is the city that never sleeps. And you know what? I perfectly fall into that category as well. Probably one of the reasons why I love this city. Okay, and the last thing, on 72nd Street, we have a monument dedicated to Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the wife of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. She was an interesting figure. She had 6 kids, one of whom died in infancy, unfortunately. And then when her husband caught polio, she represented him in many functions. She was a champion of racial equality, human rights, and fight against poverty. as well as publishing numerous books and articles. In many ways, she reminds me of Elizabeth Hamilton, wife of Alexander Hamilton. Strong women who not only supported their husbands and kids, but also contributed and accomplished so much in their own life, while balancing family life. It's quite an accomplishment. But speaking of the Hamiltons, let's go back to our main story in the video and make our way to Lower Manhattan, and specifically Trinity Church, where both Alexander Hamilton and Elizabeth are buried. Alexander Hamilton died at a young age, only 47 years old, in 1804. So just 2 years after the house was completed, the house that we saw in the beginning of the video. So here we need to talk about the famous duel that took place. Alexander Hamilton co-created a political party called the Federalists, who wanted a stronger, centralized government, while another group formed, the Republican Party, headed by people like Thomas Jefferson, for example. They were more in favor of a weaker central government and leaving more power with each individual state. Hence, they opposed certain policies of Alexander Hamilton, like a central bank. And hence, compromises had to be made, and it's actually one of the reasons why the capital of the United States today is Washington, D.C., because the first capital was New York City. However, men like Thomas Jefferson wanted the capital of the new country to be more down south and not up in the north. Therefore, an agreement was made that Alexander Hamilton was allowed to pass some of his policies, which created a stronger central government, yet a new capital would be built, which became Washington, D.C., bringing it closer to the south. In the meantime, the capital was moved to Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, for a period of 10 years as Washington was being built. Therefore, the first president to stay in Washington, D.C. was the third president, Thomas Jefferson, who moved in 1800. But anyway, as American political parties were being created, Alexander Hamilton developed a fierce political opponent, Aaron Burr, who was the vice president of the United States at that time. Let's just say that Hamilton did not have a good opinion about Aaron Burr, and Burr felt like Hamilton caused him much political hardship, as well as insult, and demanded an apology, which was not delivered, hence challenging him to a duel. The two men met across the Hudson River in New Jersey, and shortly after 7 o'clock in the morning, marched 10 paces, 10 steps in opposite directions, turned and fired, with Hamilton being hit on the right side with a bullet penetrating his liver. He died on the next day, July 12, 1804, with just enough time to say goodbye to his wife and children. It had to be a painful moment for the family, especially for his wife, as 3 years earlier, her oldest son, Philip, also died in a duel defending his father's honor. Now, this is interesting because this was not the Wild West. Duels in New York and New Jersey were illegal, although in New Jersey the penalties were less strict. Nevertheless, think about this. A vice president of the United States just shot and killed one of the founding fathers of the country in a duel, and he returned to Washington, D.C. to fulfill the role of the vice president. That is badass. Charges against him were dropped, but his political career was over as well. Like I tell my students, you think American politics are messy today. Well, study history and you will see that it was always messy. And this sure wasn't the only crazy moment in American politics. Hey, just ask another president, Ulysses S. Grant, about his arrest in Washington, D.C. as he was speeding on his horse through the streets. History is fun. But near to the cemetery and the church, about 3 streets away on Liberty Street, we have the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, so the modern Federal Reserve. it can really be traced back to Alexander Hamilton, who really laid the foundation for such a thing by establishing the financial and the credit systems really of this country. I hope you enjoyed this week's video, and I will see you soon in more New York locations. But until then, stay safe out there. Bye-bye.